Here at the Peace Research Institute Oslo, we try to understand the causes of war and the conditions for peace. For some children, the scars of war run so deep that they shape their lives from the very beginning. In most cases, children born of war are fathered by members of enemy forces and born to local women. Sometimes, these relationships are consensual, occasionally even the result of love. Sometimes, they are the result of rape. In this special episode, I speak with Ajna Jusić, a Bosnian human rights activist and founder of the organization Forgotten Children of War. Ajna's tireless work led to a landmark moment in 2023 when Bosnia and Herzegovina adopted the law on the protection of civilian victims of war. For the first time, children born of war were formally recognized as a distinct social category with equal rights. She is joined by Lejla Damon, spokesperson for the organization and for the situation of children born of war in Bosnia and internationally. Both were in Oslo to receive the University of Oslo Human Rights Award on behalf of the Forgotten Children of War Association and to share their experiences growing up as children born of war and their ongoing fight for recognition and rights. We are also joined by Inger Skjelsbæk, professor at the University of Oslo and research professor here at PRIO and leader of the EuroWARCHILD project, which investigates the experiences, rights, and needs of children born of war in Europe. I am Ajna Jusić, and this is PRIO's Peace in a Pod. Ajna, Lejla, Inger, welcome to this episode. Inger, let's start with defining what we mean when we talk about children born of war. Many might assume this term only refers to children conceived through sexual violence, but the definition is actually broader. Can you explain what lies behind the term children born of war?
The term came about when we started doing research on children born after the Second World War in Europe. Actually, a lot of the research originated in Norway, and it had to do with children conceived by German soldiers and Norwegian mothers. And these were love relations that were frowned upon and morally condemned. And there were many derogatory terms that were used for these children. So when the research started, there was a need to find a more neutral term, because in Norway they were called German children, which was not very nice. So the term children born of war came about in the research community, and it's a term that tries to encompass children conceived in different ways, but where the parents, the biological parents, represent enemy constellations in a conflict.
And under your definition, we're talking about a significant number of children then, globally, from Ukraine to Sudan, Gaza and other regions affected by conflict. Can you help us understand the scale of the issue?
It's hard to know, because to be able to assess how many children we're talking about in any given conflict, there needs to be a recognition that they exist, and there needs to be a way of identifying these children. So I think the boring answer is that we really don't know. But if we look at conflicts, what has changed since the 1990s, where there's been much more focus on conflict-related sexual violence, then you can assume that, because this violence happens many places in many ongoing conflicts, many children will also be born. But, that refers to only the group kind of conceived through violence, but keeping in mind that the definition is larger, the number of children will be quite large. And the important thing to remember is that after the conflict ends, the fate of these children, because their parents kind of represent enemies in the conflict, that can map out in many different ways, depending on how the conflict ends, what happens after, people and societies move on. So there is no number that we know, but I think in the research community, we need to talk more about how can we measure this and get a sense of overview of this in better ways than has happened in the past, because we don't really know.
And I'm wondering if this sort of, lack of knowledge about the scale of it really, or the numbers, has anything to do with the fact that there doesn't seem to be a lot of legal protections or rights or recognition for these children. I mean, are they covered under any international conventions, or is this an area where more needs to be done?
It's definitely an area where more needs to be done, because we're talking about a group of children who fall between the cracks, so to say. There's a lot of policy work and going on gender aspects of conflict, protection linked and criminal prosecution linked to conflict-related sexual violence. But the situation for the children hasn't been addressed in that kind of policy realm. And then you have the policy realm linked to rights of the child that doesn't always focus enough on the war setting. So these children are in a way in between different discourses, different policy domains. So there is a need, and I think there is a movement now to bring this more together and to see what kind of protection needs might be there that can be addressed legally and in a policy-related ways, in other ways. But for that to happen, people need to speak up. So this is why the work of Ajna and Lejla is so important, because then we learn.
Indeed, and as you just said, we have with us Ajna and Lejla in the room today. Inger, how did you meet them?
I had done research many years ago on conflict-related sexual violence in Bosnia, and I had met women who survived conflict-related sexual violence. And I was very curious when I did this work about the children. But when I did that work, these children were early school age. So people didn't want to tell me about the children for very good reasons. But I've kept in contact with people and people from Bosnia who knew that I was interested in finding out more. And so there was a Bosnian psychiatrist called Amra Delic, whom I got to know. And she said, I was going actually to Bosnia on holiday for the first time. I brought my family. And she said, well, there are these children and they are going to start this association. Maybe you would like to meet them. And so I met Ajna at a hotel in Sarajevo with the other founding members of the association. And I remember thinking to myself, oh my God, if they form this association at this young age, they will be so much in demand and in focus internationally, because I knew that there was no other organization like that in the world. So I remember telling Ajna, you need a good press person to work with you, or you need to manage this, because there will be a lot of pressure on you. And then through that, I heard about Lejla, and we communicated on email, and Lejla came to Oslo for the opening of this project that I'm now leading called EuroWARCHILD, which focuses on European children born of war across generations in a European context.
Ajna, you found out about your father's identity, the circumstances of your conception, if I may say it like this, through a diary at your mother's house. How old were you, and what was your reaction, and did you talk to your mother about it?
I was 15. Now I'm 31, and I think the memory of it's not anymore really clear like before, but from this perspective I can say that I was really shocked, because, to be honest, I didn't need that information. I have my stepfather, which is my real father. I love him as a real father, and I was satisfied with that family construction, structure. But I was society pushed in that direction to start digging in such early ages, like 15 years old, because I was constantly asked about father's name, and I was trying to offer my stepfather's name, but they didn't accept that. And in that adventure, I found those papers, and for me, I think that biggest shock was that I didn't know what's rape. It's a reality of that. I never before learn about that, hear about that, and I think that all these details that I had to read in 8 pages was really tough I was a child, for child, and when I realized that it's not good, it's really awful, and I think that first thought was like, I don't want to be a reminder on this. It's kind of, I think, natural thought in that moment. But I think it's good that I found out. It's realistically, it's my right, and I'm very happy to know. But also, I know that because of the society push and because of the state. Because they didn't take any actions of that, I kind of pushed my mother to go earlier in that process because I'm completely sure that she would tell me in some proper age. But yeah, I think it's now from this perspective, for me, it's now, let's say, easier to talk about that because I have a different perspective. I have knowledge on that. And also I have this strong bond with my family, with my mother, and so many unknown things are clarified now through the years when we gather the strength to talk about that, which is good.
You've said society pushed you. How did that pressure manifest itself?
I don't, they pushed me in the way, like, sometimes I have a feeling that they didn't know the other way. Because they asked me in the school about father's name, and on the end of the day, when you don't have that basic information, okay, other children gonna smile at it, which is still fine, but also I'm just always till today surprised that we have that question in Bosnia, even that we know that there is 20 to 50,000 survivors and that you can have these kind of children. And for me, I'm not angry on society, I'm not angry on the state, but the action that I took after that is change that in documentation so that we don't have to respond those questions. Not just me, it's about right to choose what you want to share, and not just for children born out of war, it's for all citizens. And also it's significant for us that we clarify the mother's role, the women's role in the legal system, in society, which is good. So I was not angry, which is, I think, more important information in this question, and my action was to change that.
Lejla, things were a little different for you. You were adopted and smuggled, I believe, from Bosnia, and you grew up in the UK. Can you tell us about how you found out about where you come from?
So my story is a bit different. I've grown up in the UK. My parents adopted me when I was 9 days old. So my adoptive parents, my parents, I'll call them. And then I grew up in the UK, and I think I first started asking questions about myself in terms of just from a school perspective, in a school environment, around, what time were you born, what day were you born? And that's when I went home and I asked my mum, what day was I born, what time? And she said, you're adopted. And you're adopted from Bosnia because your biological mother couldn't look after you because there was a war at the time. Now, that was about as high level as we went, and still it took some processing of understanding what adoption meant. And I do remember it because I remember thinking at the time, I'm different. Like, that was the one overarching feeling of kind of like, your stomach dropping slightly of, I'm not sure what I'm going to go back into school and say. But over the course of my childhood, we'd continue to go back to Bosnia, specifically Sarajevo. My parents had family friends there from their time of being journalists during the war that we always went to visit. And then when I was 18, I asked my parents for my 18th birthday to go to Sarajevo for a holiday with my boyfriend at the time. And I spent 3 weeks in Sarajevo. But prior to that, my parents told me about my origin story and all the documentation that went with it. So obviously I was adopted, and there's a lot of legal papers around the adoption because it was at the Old Bailey in London, because they didn't necessarily have all the documentation that they needed to fully adopt me. And my parents had gone back to try and find my biological mother after they'd kind of initially taken me out of the country. And that was kind of the first instance of understanding, okay, I was a child born of war, or specifically sexual violence. And then also what my biological mother had to endure, because there was some bits of her testimony of how she felt at the time, and the fact that they couldn't find her afterwards, after the fact. That was kind of when I first initially got told. And then I went to Bosnia for my 3-week holiday, which was lovely. But it's constantly been there throughout kind of me growing up and becoming an adult, going to Bosnia and knowing my origins. It's just the development of the story has continued to evolve, which I think is the thing that's continuing, because I then went to go meet my biological mother.
You met her then?
I met her with Ina. So again, Amra Delic put me and Ina in touch, and I think it was in 2014. And we met, and I told her my story, you know, that I was a child born of war, and that my biological mother and I had, at this point, been sharing some letter communication, because I'd gone to the Bosnian embassy in London and asked them to help find her, because I did have her on my birth certificate, her name. And so they did, and they found her. And because I don't speak Bosnian, letter format was the appropriate mode of communication, because I could get it translated. And so we'd had this communication for about 2.5 years. And I told Ina about it. I told her, showed her some of the letters, or, you know, showed her kind of where she lived. And she lived in Sarajevo. So Ina, you know, then ended up, after we'd met for the first time, going and speaking to her, just to say, you know, I've met Lejla. I can vouch she is the person she says she is. And then I think it was only 3 months. I went in the August and I came back in the October with my family. And that's when we went and met my biological mother again, which was a really unique experience, not only because my parents had met her previously, but also, you know, it's highly emotional in terms of just, I wasn't sure how the situation was going to go. So it was both emotional for me, Ina, and I think everyone in the room.
And you mentioned that it was already quite something to process as a child to know that you've been adopted. How does one go about processing this reality that you were born out of sexual violence?
Yeah, I think for me, I think initially I probably would say growing up, I didn't do that much processing. I didn't maybe handle it very well. I did feel very alone, isolated, especially. I had fantastic family, great friends, you know, brilliant, but no one that represented who I was or where I came from, you know, so it was quite hard to find that sense of belonging. I think what really helped was initially, you know, I found out kind of what the origin stories, the information when I was 18. And it was when I was 19 that I then started campaigning and doing advocacy with WARCHILD, which was a charity started in Bosnia at the time that is based in the UK, has offices in the UK. And I was on a youth engagement panel with other children who have experienced war and conflict. Now, that could be a whole range of different, you know, their parents had to flee their home country because, you know, they were in fear of being persecuted and so on. And it was when I started meeting other people that had also been affected by war. Maybe their stories weren't exactly the same. They weren't children born out of sexual violence, but it was there that I was like, okay, I can kind of talk to you about these things,
sense
and
of
you
kinship,
understand,
perhaps.
yeah, and you can understand where that comes from. So that was really when I first started the advocacy. And then it was the same. So the Preventing Sexual and Violence and Conflict Summit happened that year when I'd started on that youth engagement panel. And I think part of my journey and how I've processed it is by doing the advocacy work. I find it very cathartic. I find it's the right thing to do. And that's helped. And then after that, and as I've grown older, you know, experiencing different conversations with my biological mom and just getting older and understanding how I feel, then I've had therapy and counselling and so on. So just to kind of develop that even more and to just understand, some of the things that you need to work through.
Right. And as you said, advocacy has been a big part of you processing your origin story, as you call it. Ina, you lead the Forgotten Children of War Association, which you also co-founded. Talk to us about your association. Why was it important for you to create it?
I think that having this association is a kind of opportunity to fight for your rights with your voice, and also giving the voice and telling stories, some kind of therapy, because everything that happened to our mothers and everything that we survived as a children, it's not just about us. It should be a societal question, and society should understand that this kind of heritage for our state, and society should be aware of those kind of consequences, no matter which ethnic group everyone is a part of. I think that association got opportunity to, let's say, to break the gap on this topic. But as Inger mentioned in the beginning, we didn't even know that it's going to be such a big thing, but I'm glad that it is. But for us, I think it was, first of all, important to announce our existence in Bosnia and tell that we have a group of people that are not enjoying the human rights, but also to break that lie that our mothers are guilty for it, because they are not guilty for that. And for us, it was really important to change that narrative in society about survivors, and also to bring attention on survivors as a human beings, not ethnic beings, in environment of Bosnia. Changing the law in Bosnia, getting the law of the civilian victims of war, in which children are recognized as a civilian victim of war, it's really good results. But also, from the beginning, we know that law can be a really good thing, but still we cannot enjoy the law if society is not kind of changed in this perspective. So I mentioned that also last night in our methodology. Yeah, we use art as a main weapon, let's say like that, but also in our methodology is to raise awareness on the fact that if there is a 20 to 50,000 survivors, that means that we are surrounded by 20 to 50 rapists around us, and that is a reality of the state and region in which we live. And I think it is that changing that perspective was really helpful, and we are still in that process. But I think that children born of war in our society build kind of bridge between ethnic groups, because when it comes to the children and generally sexual violence, there is no part of Bosnia in which you don't have survivors. No matter is it Croatian part, Bosniak part, or Serbian part, it's a reality of our consequences of war. And I think that building, as a country, we don't have unique and one history book. We have three different books, three different educational systems. But for us, it's really important to push that unique book of consequences of war, because it's about human beings. Everyone loses something, and everyone should feel that they don't want to go there again, and that it is not correct to create a state in which our children gonna repeat that kind of war crimes, whatever. So, yeah, it's a good work.
I mean, you emphasize the very important point that we're talking about human beings here. Yes, there is the state and the law, but we're talking ultimately about people. And what I find fascinating about your association is that it really emphasizes artistic expression. And I wanted to ask you, what does art allow you and others to express compared to more traditional advocacy forms?
Art is a proof of someone's existence, and it's not something that it can be just deleted in the future. It's gonna become a kind of heritage again, and it's gonna stay. And also for us in the state, like in a country like Bosnia, and the system like Bosnia, is art is a process of we can fight patriarchy there, we can fight ethnic narratives there, and we always win using the art, which is really important. And art, like general thing, is really highly appreciated in our state, and we knew that we don't care what the institution is gonna say, but we knew that people gonna come because they love art, and it is really unique stuff in our country. And I think through the art, when you go through different processes, like in making movies or exhibition, in, I don't know, theater performances, that's the brilliant opportunity for each child or each mother involved to see personal story from different perspective. And I think that especially in the theater performances, when you see actors going through your story on the stage and you hear their perspective in the back scene, I think it's good. It's a healing to understand that it's a proof that when you give your story, people gonna accept it. Everyone has different view on that, but for you as a person, it's really important to hear those different perspectives, to understand, because I think being angry on society and on people is not right direction. I think making understanding and empathy space, it's good for children and good for society. And through art, we felt that And also art is something that, for me, it's when we are in the room, we're surrounded by art, we are human beings, not different names or different religions. And I think it's, for us, it's the best methodology we could use from the beginning.
And through your work and advocacy, you've both become sort of the face for something that is quite taboo in many places, with a lot of stigma attached to it. What has been the reaction of your community, your friends, your loved one, when they learn about your background and the work you do? Lejla?
I think it's really different. So I remember going to university, for instance, and I became really close with a girl called Hannah, and we were in the same we lived together in the same house, and we'd been friends for 6 months. And then, we were talking, she was like, oh, where were you born? And I was like, oh, in Sarajevo. And I told her my story, and she just couldn't believe it. And but she also couldn't believe I'd said it sooner. But I'm not sure, for a really long time, especially growing up, I wasn't sure how to approach it with people, because obviously my name, Lejla, is a Bosnian name. It's got a J, it's unusual. And so people would be like, where are you from? And I'd kind of, tell them, and then they'd keep kind of asking. And then sometimes you could see that people weren't prepared for what you were about to say. And this could be a very informal chat with a stranger. And then you feel a little bit like you're holding them, or you just get a lot of, I'm sorry. So growing up, it was really unique, kind of having the story that I had. And it gave a lot of different reactions. And I think because it was growing up in the UK, people, depending on their age range, will have seen the Bosnian conflict play out on the news. So they'd have some awareness of it. And then there'd be others that are my peer set or my age that were babies when it was going on. So they wouldn't have any concept of it. So you were really kind of educating them for the first time. I think I've had very mild reactions to a certain extent. Sometimes the advocacy work from a Twitter social media point of view, yes, you do get trolled and stuff like that. That's just part of social media. And people saying, oh, it never happened, or you're kind of lying and things like that. So that's one space. But I think from an advocacy point of view, and being held by the different NGOs that I've worked for, and also the Foreign Office, they've been really supportive of talking about children born out of sexual violence. I know it was fairly early and something new to them initially when the Preventing Sexual Violence and Conflict Summit happened for the first time. It wasn't something that was very common knowledge, and that was the first time I came out with my story, so it did feel really big at the time. But it's a very different experience to, I assume, what it would be like living in Bosnia and kind of communicating and talking about it. This is far more an education and raising awareness kind of piece within the UK, because that's just kind of the remit. But yeah, it's probably different.
Right, you come from quite a different place to Ajna. You, I understand, come from a small community. You now live in Sarajevo. But what have been the reaction and perhaps the consequences of becoming a face for these forgotten children?
Yeah, when you tell your story, you don't speak just about yourself, you speak about whole your family, and it was sometimes tough because all members of family kind of hide that all these years. So yeah, for me it was the most important part that my mother and my stepfather make family decision to go through that, and that was the most important part for me. And I think that from my memory, in the first time when I published my story online, it was a weird situation. Everyone was pretty shocked, especially those people that I lied before, my father was dead or something. And I was like, that is what it is. I don't care. I cannot change that now. It's reality. It was weird, but in one moment that exploded. And what I remember specifically, that exploded from the younger generation, from my age generation. They was like, oh my God, it's that was the first time that they thought about that, think about that, and I really appreciate. And that's my belief in younger generation, our generation in Bosnia, that we can make a change. later, as Lejla mentioned, you had different cases, messages and things, but I didn't care a lot about them. And when you are in the big city, I'm now in Sarajevo, change is obvious, support is much bigger, and knowledge is much bigger, and everything is fine. But in small communities, there is not a lot of change. People don't want to talk about that. They are still avoiding that topic, which is okay, but at least you break that life circle in those small communities. Like, here you go, you have this as a truth, and you can share it, you can talk about it, but first of all, you know that, and that's most important. And any action that you take from that, it's on you. Now, knowledge is not excuse. Like, I didn't know. Yes, you know. And I think that sharing the information about ourselves is sharing responsibility. It's not just my problem. It's also your problem, even if you are not born out of war, and every action you take, it's your responsibility, and that's more than enough for me and for my mother and my father. So for us, it was responsibility sharing, really important task.
You mentioned that young people your generation, had a sort of strong reaction to it. What about the older generation?
Yeah, younger generation, yeah, and which is also important to mention, all ethnic groups. Young people were really supportive and shocked, but yeah, older generation, it's obviously more female support. Really small number of, I don't know, in the beginning, small number of men were supporting that, but now it's kind of better in that, you cannot push. I don't feel free to push older generation to go through that, because if I push them to it's a traumatization process. Everyone has someone that survived. Everyone lose someone. So many people watch rape during the war. They were in the camps, and I don't want to push that people a lot. And we are trying through the public events, public speeches, art, just to change perspective. She is not guilty for that, and these children are not children of enemies. They are Bosnian children. They are mother's children, and we are here, and we don't ask nothing from you, just acceptance and changing the perspective. You don't have to talk about that. Just know in your heart, in your mind, and that's, I think, most important step, because when they understand that, they're not gonna discriminate my mother in her village, which is good. So due to the respect that what they survived, I cannot even imagine what is war and what they survived. I don't want to push that, but if they are silent, that has to be respectful silent.
I understand. Inger, you mentioned earlier that there are no little legal protections or recognition for children born of war, but there is one UN Security Council resolution, Resolution 1325, which does address sexual violence as a weapon of war. Does the resolution address experiences of children born of war at all, or is there still a gap in addressing their unique vulnerabilities?
There is a little bit of a movement now. Initially, when the resolution was adopted, the first one, 1325, there was not much mention about children conceived through wartime sexual violence. But there's been a lot of work going on in the UN, and now the latest reports from the SRSG on conflict-related sexual violence now has started to address children conceived through wartime sexual violence, and that is important. But I also want to underscore that the group is larger also than only children born by conflict-related sexual violence. There are many children who can be seen as these representatives of the conflict pattern that was during the conflict. So I think we need to push further also to include other groups as well. But the conflict-related sexual violence, children conceived through that, are now being, there's language, international language on this that wasn't there before. So, just to underscore again what Lejla and I are doing is super important to get that attention across.
And on that note, as we wrap this episode, it's important to remind listeners once again that there are children in Ukraine, in Gaza, in Sudan being conceived and being born or soon to be born out of the violence, sexual violence and war taking place in these countries. And they will grow up and they will ask questions. And for some of them, they learn about their background at some point. I want to ask Ajna and Lejla, what do you want the world to know about them? What change would you like to see happen? Lejla?
I mean, I think the change that I'd like to see happen is that continued recognition that they are children, they are innocent, and they aren't children of the enemy. I think me and Ajna were in Colombia last week and we were speaking to quite a few people about, the situation in South Sudan and children just being left, that were children born of war, just left, And with that, there was a kind of, they were talking about trying to keep midwives, engaging with the mothers even throughout their pregnancy to talk about the fact that they're having a baby and what that means. But so, when it did come to them giving birth, it didn't just leave the child, they had already had a connection to it to prevent that situation from occurring. I think it varies by country, by conflict. It's really different, right? And there's no one-size-fits-all approach. I think for me, the biggest thing that we can take from, the Forgotten Children of War Association from Bosnia is how can we take what we've already learnt through associations like the Forgotten Children of War, through those children who are now 30, and how can we take those learnings and then apply them to certain conflicts that fits, or that could help. It's not going to be perfect, but there at least are lessons that can be learned from conflicts that have previously happened. And I think it's continuing that dialogue and that conversation.
Ajna?
Yeah, and I agree with Lejla, and also I'm going to just add on that I think that prevention dialogue should be started, and I want to see that tomorrow. Very, very important things. But I think for me, I was raised by my mother. I was with her all my life, and what I find it very problematic is that everyone has their own methodology, and it's not good. We need to create a unique methodology for children, and I think that trying to create at least some unique attitude on this topic and where we should push, because if you treat survivors as an experiment during the 3 decades, it's not good. It's not good. They are not experiments, they are human beings on the end of the day. So, and I see the devastating consequences after war on my mother because of these different methodologies in work, how we should support survivors. That's not something that I would love children to don't survive in the future. So let's do our job, but let's just try to have at least same values and same aims, and we can use different ways. But I think that it is really, really important, and I'm kind of pushing that idea now. And I think that we cannot also forget the other countries. We cannot just put attention on few countries, but also we should have in mind that current conflicts are areas in which we can prevent everything that happened in Bosnia for being invisible for 3 decades. And then, I don't know, what is happening in Uganda also. All these things should be on the table. And I think that in this moment, we should create a space for children in the way, like gather the children in one room from different categories and to see what is similar and what is different, and start from that.
Inger, last words?
Yeah, I just want to add, building on one of the things that Ajna mentioned also, and something that we've seen in our research is the importance of papers that document who you are. This comes across in many conversations that we have had, that if there could be some sort of international agreement on some sort of document that recognizes your existence as a child born of war, and maybe the father cannot be named, but you can still have a valid, leaves you out of certain things that you have a right to do, and which is also part of this new law in Bosnia, is that to have the right to access different kinds of services without necessarily naming your father. I think this is not rocket science. This is something that can be done, but I think it requires international commitment. But this is something that I see that is tangible and could be useful to work on towards some sort of documentation of children born of war that is a valid document they can have through life.
Ajna, Lejla, Inger, thank you very much. This episode was produced by your host Arno Siad. To find out more about the EuroWARCHILD project, visit EuroWARCHILD.org. And as always, you can find PRIO's cutting-edge research, policy briefs, and events on PRIO.org.